Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is William Lynn. William Lynn is the founder of PanWorks, an independent center for ethics and policy. Bill was a professor at Green Mountain College, Tufts University, and Williams College, where he taught courses in animal studies, environmental ethics, human geography, and public policy. He helped found the journal Ethics, Policy, and Environment. He has written many academic and popular publications about wolf recovery, outdoor cats, biodiversity, rewilding, urban ecology, and on and on. And he has also given many keynote presentations on ethic-based facilitations and training. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction. I appreciate it.
Would you like to make some introductory comments?
Sure. Let me say a little bit about PanWorks so people have a broader understanding of the position, the place that I'm coming from. As you so rightly said, we're an independent think tank. We focus on the well-being of animals. We use ethics, science, and policy to basically envision and establish a world where people, animals, and nature can flourish. This is a very interdisciplinary undertaking, as you can probably imagine. We focus on building ethical capacity of individuals, of organizations, and of the broader community. And we do that through the regular means that folks would be familiar with, academic research, education of various kinds, and of course outreach, which is probably one of our most important activities through our podcast, through our Medium column, and other things like that. The people at PanWorks are notable for a variety of contributions in the animal and conservation spaces, particularly with respect to compassionate conservation, an alternative vision and emergent paradigm of what conservation ought to be, the ethics of rewilding, which is to say, rewilding is not just about science, it's not just about ecology, it's not just about large landscape conservation, it's also an ethical commitment to the well-being of animals and the rest of nature. And in terms of bringing all that into actual practice as part of government policy, we've done the first ethics work in the federal government with respect to animals and nature, particularly through the Barred Owl Stakeholder Group, and later, just last year, through the National Wolf Conversation. One last thing I want to say. While we were inspired by Mary Midgley, who's an amazing philosopher, who appeared at the American Museum of Natural History's Wolves and Human Community event to engage in this work to cultivate and catalyze conversations around ethics, carnivores, wildlife, nature. It's not as if people hadn't been doing that before. Environmental ethicists and animal ethicists had been thinking about that before, but it was rather dry and abstract and bloodless, and we wanted it to have legs. We wanted the rubber to hit the road and to make it really relevant for public policy so we can envision and create that world that helps people, animals, and nature flourish. But there was also a second piece to this. And this is the recognition, and this will be controversial, but the recognition that the animal community and the environmental community have succeeded in many steps along the way, but overall they failed. They failed in their goal for truly nature-friendly, sustainable society. And the major reason, in my mind, why they failed is they never learned the lessons from the far right, which developed an ecosystem of power and influence through think tanks, media organizations, advocacy groups, legal groups, and in alliance with public policies that actually frame these issues for the American public, define the parameters of the political debate, and here we are today. So, in a concrete way, we've gone through 3 wolf wars. One was the first extermination of wolves in the lower 48. The second was the recovery starting in 1970s of wolves, but then being stymied over time up to date. And now it appears that that battle has been lost, and we're starting wolf recovery all over again. This is what I mean by learning the need to learn the lessons from the far right about how to organize with an ecosystem of organizations that create power and influence to frame the understanding in the American public and get them behind the ethics, the science, the practice of living with a wilder world. And that's all, I'll wrap that up.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that comprehensive introduction. You just said that PanWorks takes an interdisciplinary approach for securing the well-being of animals. You think the natural science model of research is overrated in environmental conservation. You want a triangulation of science, ethics, and policy.
Correct.
Would you elaborate on how this process works?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's start out and not diminish the role of science and those people who are scientists. Absolutely essential, absolutely indispensable. The problem is when you get to public policy and when you're talking about human affairs, facts do not drive the debates. They do not drive the policy decisions. Values drive the debates. Values drive the policy decisions. Facts are marshaled, for good or ill, into those debates over values, but it's values that are driving the process. So what you need is you need to use science and ethics to help you make transparent and help you keep accountable your facts as well as your values. And then use facts and values, science and ethics to triangulate between better or worse policy decisions. I'm someone who doesn't believe that there's any easy silver bullet technical fix to the problems that we face as a policy matter in any realm of human endeavor, including wildlife and conservation. But you can distinguish better from worse and really good versus really bad approaches to public policy, and you use ethics and science to triangulate in that way. Now, of course, this requires an interdisciplinary mindset. You need to know something about the science. You need to know something about the ethics. You need to be open and welcoming to different points of view from those different perspectives. And you need to have the capacity to bring them together so they can triangulate on producing better public policy.
Okay. I think and I want to emphasize this, friendly criticism of the science of conservation biology is that it focuses on populations and ecosystems, which can lead to inadequate concern about individual animals and may also lead to methods that harm animals. Is this a fair interpretation of your criticism of the discipline of conservation biology?
It's very fair. Once again, conservation biology is essential. And we work with conservation biologists. We have conservation biologists, trained conservation biologists on staff, so to speak, at PanWorks. But there's a moral orthodoxy that is developed in conservation biology. Ecology is good. No, I should say evolution is good. Ecology is good. Biodiversity is good. All of these have intrinsic value independent from their instrumental value. But one of those postulates that Soule included but didn't label as a postulate is that individual animals don't matter. Mm-hmm. And that has become part of the moral orthodoxy, so much so that when you raise questions about the ethics of our treatment of animals within conservation biology, it's often waved away because the claim is we're talking about populations, we're not talking about individuals, and we don't have to engage in scientific or ethical debate about the role of individuals in those populations or what our direct obligations are from an ethics point of view to the well-being of individual animals, those animals in their ecological and social communities, the larger community of life. Mm-hmm. So in that friendly way, we really push back. And that's a big piece of what compassionate conservation does, is it pushes back in those regards against more traditional forms of conservation and the moral orthodoxy in conservation biology. I will say this, though. When Michael Soule wrote that article, he was very influenced by Arnie Nace, meeting Arnie Nace at the Buddhist center outside of Los Angeles, and thinking when he articulated the postulates, he articulated them as what Arnie Nace would call ultimate premises. Now, Arnie Nace was a Norwegian philosopher and the founder of ecosophy, often called deep ecology, especially here in North America. Arnie Nace was quite aware that when he said ultimate premises, he meant to say that, sure, we all have prior commitments and these ultimate premises upon which we base our ethics, but none of us have access to the absolute truth. And there's always wiggle room around those ultimate premises. And they never can be fully, absolutely reduced to some kind of fact of nature or fact of society. They're an interpretation of how we ought to live with others, including people, animals, and the rest of nature. And that's what Soule was doing. His postulates are his ultimate premises from which he was working out the mission-oriented discipline of conservation biology. What's happened is those postulates, those ultimate premises that were always meant to be corrigible, to be adaptable, to be challengeable, have solidified into this moral orthodoxy, which constrains the thinking of many in conservation biology.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One thing that confuses me, so the question itself may be a little confusing, but here it is. Do you think that science can integrate ethics into its research, or is your point that ethics should enter into the issue at the level where the right course of action is decided?
The question is not confusing, and the answer is both. Mm-hmm. And let me take us back to Newton. Newton is generally credited with shifting science over from the Baconian and the Descartesian version of the individual working out a scientific system to seeing science as a practice of a larger epistemic community, a community of knowledge. And that's encapsulated in his phrase, if I've seen farther than others, it's because I have stood on the shoulder of giants. Part of what Newton's talking about there is an ethics of truth and trust that is foundational to the practice of science as a community activity. You have to trust that other scientists are telling you the truth from their perspective. Everything from the data that's collected to the analysis of the results. And of course, we have lots of examples of scientific misconduct where that isn't true. They're illustrating the importance of what Newton was trying to say there. From that, we've seen that the ethics of science is integral to the practice of science itself. The great illustration out of the 20th century of that has to do with the lessons we learned from Nuremberg and Tuskegee in terms of the protection of human subjects, thence applied to the protection of animal subjects. You can't do good science unless you protect the well-being of the subjects that the science is being conducted upon or being undertaken for. There's various ways we can frame that language. And then there's this issue of how ethics can inform the sciences themselves. So the sciences, they're not driving the values-laden debates, but they do give us descriptions of the causal features that are going on in the world, options about what we might do about that. And that scientific information can help us select better versus worse ethical directions that we might take in the course of public policy. This is all part of that process of triangulation. So in both senses, science is a practice that involves ethics, and ethics is a practice that informs public policy.
Okay. I'm going to make a summary statement of what I got out of a few of your essays and then let you comment on it.
Sure.
I think you are arguing that science is value-laden and that the task of what you call descriptive ethics is to expose the values already there in science for the purpose of opening up space for new and better values, which is the task of what you call normative ethics. Is this what you are saying?
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. I would step back and say that the descriptive ethics part is sort of revealing the moral norms that are embedded in science. But it's not just science. It's embedded in public policy in general. It's embedded in how people in society are thinking about matters. So it has a wider ambit than just science itself. And then the other thing I would say with respect to the normative ethics side is that it's not just sort of cleaning out science of bad values, let's say, in order to bring in good values, because that presupposes that there's mostly bad values in there. I don't tend to think that way. So let's go back to conservation biology. Many conservation biologists are worried about the community of life, of biodiversity, of ecological communities, of ecosystems. I think that's all good. I'm right there with them. I care about those matters too. I don't want animal concerns, the individual well-being of animals, let's say, to supplant those. I want them to complement them. So it's not a matter of eliminating bad values for good values. It's more taking account of the totality of values that we can use once again to triangulate about how we ought to live with people, animals, and nature.
Okay. So one more formulation, just to be clear, before we can get on to a number of other questions. You want to speak to the latent moral values in agency people, for example, so they may become aware of the values that drive their thinking and work. And then as a result of that, open up a space for new values to emerge. Is that correct?
It's partially correct. And again, I don't mean to be rude and say you've got it wrong. I just want to sort of relax the notion that it's a corrective to people having bad values, and also that they're not aware of their values. I've trained hundreds of agency folks and thousands of people over the course of my career. And if I get enough time with them, I never have an experience where someone doesn't come to me, often in tears, reflecting about how our conversations of ethics reminded them of why they got into wildlife management or conservation biology or some other caring scientific profession, if I can put it like that, in the first place. They already have those values. And often those values are just fine. They're values I resonate with. And I don't pretend to think that I have an exclusive bundle of values that everybody else must share or have, or that they don't already have themselves. But this discussion of ethics opens the door to what is often shut down in scientific and quantitative disciplines. And it's been shut down not because the disciplines themselves need or require that we not think about values. It's because the cultures of those disciplines have developed a notion that they're value-free, and to be a good scientist or to be a good manager or to be a good member of an agency, you have to push questions of values to the side, not take a stand on them, pretend as if they don't exist in your work, whether it's scientific or whether it's bureaucratic. And bringing ethics to the table opens up the conversations so people can talk about their own values, they can explore the values of other people, and once again, by triangulation, deepen and better their understanding of how they think themselves, as well as how others think about these issues.
Okay, I see the difference. Looking at the specific case of wolves, you say that wolf recovery is about values, that it's a moral dispute, because science can never tell us enough of what we need to know about wolves. Can you elaborate on this a bit?
Sure. Look, wolves existed just fine before we got to North America. And they just existed just fine with the First Nations people who lived in North America. I'm not saying there were never conflicts, but, they existed fine. Science is not going to tell us how wolves can thrive per se. Wolves can do that on their own. What science is going to do is tell us how not to interfere and depredate wolves, and thus allow them to exist in a landscape that's been transformed by us. Secondly, we already know enough about wolves, about what we need to do to allow them to thrive, to allow them to live their own lives as individuals, as members of their social and ecological communities. The reason why we don't do that is because of human values. And so it's looking at those values as the primary driver of the wolf-human conflict that's going to open up the possibility of mitigating, diminishing, eliminating that kind of conflict. Once again, science isn't peripheral. Science is not unimportant. It's very important in terms of giving us facts and giving us causal knowledge, and that we can use to triangulate on better public policies. But the public policies we choose about whether to let wolves thrive or to depredate them are almost entirely questions of human values.
Mm-hmm. You think that it is through dialogue with others that we reach deeper and better understanding of ourselves and others. I get
That's
that.
Right.
But you also seem to be saying something stronger, namely that the concept of intrinsic value, or the idea that every form of life has value regardless of its worth to human beings, needs to be part of all meaningful conversation about animals, including wolves. Is that correct?
That's correct. Let me make a proviso and take you back to the first conversation. What you're talking about is, the technical term for this is hermeneutics. Very old perspective out of the social sciences. Those of you who are familiar with qualitative methods of any sort or ethnography or any sort, all of that arises out of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics has this notion of fusion of horizons. That I see the world in a particular way, with worldview. Others have a different worldview. Even if we're standing in the same spot, our social histories, our relationship with others have led us to see the world in slightly different ways. We can fuse those horizons by overlapping them and discussing them together. We can learn how other people think about the world, but that doesn't resolve conflict, and this is the point I'm making. Sometimes we come to a better understanding of what we disagree about, or if we understand at all, we only understand partially. We're still confused. It doesn't resolve the conflicts that human beings have from a particular points of view. And it doesn't resolve when different worldviews really do think about people, animals, and nature in very different ways. So there's very anthropocentric views, which regard human beings as the summum bonum of life, and all moral questions, only humans have moral value, and if animals or nature have moral value, it's much less, and they get on the back of the bus. Versus a geocentric perspective that thinks people, animals, and nature all have moral value. And we have to think about all three of those separate but intersecting realms of value simultaneously. You can't, people may, but my experience is this. I won't go make it too complex. My experience is that whenever I've talked with people who fundamentally disagree with my worldview, they may not change and become believers in how I think about the world, but they do honestly change their minds in the sense that they don't think I'm being totally irrational or totally unreasonable. Here I'm thinking about the conversations I've had with ranchers about wolves. Mm-hmm. We're going to. I'm thinking of the several of the ranchers I met at the National Wolf Conversation. We're going to have differences over policy. I think wolves should be everywhere that wolves can travel to. Other people are really worried about that, and they want wolves walled off in a corner of a state or a corner of the continent. But I think these conversations have really helped people understand how I think about the world and recognize that it's not irrational, it's not unreasonable, and it may be something that it's worthwhile then thinking through.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's the first thing I wanted to go back to. Was there more you wanted to? I think it's important because it's really talking about, to put a term on it, deliberative public policy. Sitting down with people, deliberating together, hearing different points of view, trying to, as Socrates says, we know more together than we do alone, and trying to develop that to triangulate politically on those good forms of public policy.
I know you place a lot of importance on the fact that animals have sentience and sapience, that they feel, suffer, and have a kind of self-awareness. And I know that you have been an animal trustee, or a person who participates in public discussions explicitly representing the interests and well-being of animals. What distinguishes an animal trustee from simply being an advocate for wildlife? Don't environmentalists and conservationists already speak for the well-being of animals?
They definitely speak to it. and I wouldn't restrict it just to animal advocates or conservationists. I know many of the ranchers I've talked to, many of the agency folks here, I'm going back to wolves, also believe, whether I agree with them or not, that they're speaking for the well-being of animals too, whether that's about wolves, whether it's about working dogs, whether it's about the production animals that they're raising, etc. I think, and all of us can acknowledge in those roles the intrinsic value of animals. The question of the animal trustee, it certainly starts with the intrinsic value of animals, and recognizing that that intrinsic value for animals like human beings or other non-human animals is in large part because we are sentient, sapient, and social. We're aware, we're self-aware, we're in relationships with others. We're conscious, self-conscious creatures. That's another way of saying this in a really easy formulation. Because we're self-conscious creatures, we have duties to each other because we can self-conscious creatures are something special, partly because they're self-conscious. When we think about ourselves, we think that we can be harmed, our well-being can be promoted or can be detracted from, and we think our lives are valuable. And, I want my well-being to be protected, and I don't want to allow other people to victimize me. Well, there's something similar going on with other animals. And whether those advocates are promoting the well-being of wolves, or whether those ranchers are talking about the well-being of their cattle, they're in some senses advocating properly for the creatures that they're concerned about. What makes a trustee different is that the trustee brackets their social identity, their professional identity, and other human interests to represent the well-being of animal or animals directly. It's when you get into, like, say, stakeholder groups, even the advocates, and we've had advocates say this to me directly, even the advocates who want to promote the well-being of wolves are constrained by their institutional organizational policies. And in poor stakeholder processes or poor governmental processes, think of a congressional hearing, all people do is attack each other and spout their organizational policy positions. They're not engaged in deliberative democracy. The trustee sets that stuff aside, is free to represent the interests and well-being of animals themselves.
Right. I got it.
Of course, that depends on our ethical understanding of animals. It depends on our scientific understanding of animals. But the reason why, part of the reason why the trustee practice exists is because of my experience with the Barred Owl Stakeholder Group. We created what was called a safe harbor in that group, so that folks in the deliberations we had about what to do about barred owls in the context of spotted owls, we were perfectly free to discuss anything we thought or anything that other people thought out of that meeting. But we could not tag individuals. Why? Because the Audubon Society might have a different perspective than the Forest Society, and their representatives could be at risk if they didn't toe their party line. By creating safe harbor, we preserve the capacity to have a true deliberative dialogue about what we ought to do about barred owls for the benefit of spotted owls. And that fundamentally changed the dynamic of the conversation. Animal trustees do something similar because someone's there representing animals. It's not just about human stakeholder interests. Animals are stakeholders here too. And they're not beholden to an organizational perspective that requires them to, let's say, support the trophy hunting of wolves, when they don't believe that trophy hunting wolves is in the wolves' best interest. Do you see what I mean?
I do. I get it. I get the gist of it.
Yeah.
I'm going to elaborate on it with another question here. Do you think of an animal trustee as a legal concept, and do you see it as something that could eventually become institutionalized in government?
Well, I think of it as both a legal concept and an ethics concept, and the two are tightly related, and they're tightly related historically. So the practice of having a trustee was a legal codification of what was an ethical practice of entrusting your estate to someone after your death, or entrusting the well-being of your minor children to someone after your death. And there is now on the books in almost all 50 states what's called an animal trustee. And this is a statutory law that's been passed that allows animals who are generally considered property under the law and cannot be trustees because they're property, to be, in this case, regarded as trustees, so that, let's say, pet animals can have a small pot of money put aside for them for their well-being in later life after, let's say, their guardian passes away, and someone will act as their trustee. So there already is that legal practice. Now, the person who brought this to our attention was Chris Stewart, who's one of our fellows and a member of our board. She is a lawyer, she's an ethicist, and she's very interested in this animal trustee legal framework. So it is a legal framework, and as a legal framework, it's very well codified with some very stringent requirements around it.
I think it's a wonderful idea.
It is a wonderful idea. There's a problem with that, however, is that in that it can be interpreted as in a rigid manner, such that you're only representing one set of animals and not others, let's say wolves and not the deer. And you're not, and as you're representing those animals, you're not it's not possible for you to engage in the full deliberative public policy, which involves compromising and negotiating how it is that wildlife management, wildlife relations, human-animal relations should be thought about and should be practiced. So I focus more on the ethical dimension that was also part of the origins of our concept of trusteeship, so that there is more flexibility for me to think about the wolf in the context of the larger community of life. And for me to recognize that even though I might disagree about policies about lethal management of wolves, I'm going to have to accept that some people think in those ways and negotiate with them in order to make progress over time for the well-being of wolves.
Do you think wilderness might also deserve some form of representation in our political and ethical deliberations? Or is sentience and sapience the qualities for trusteeship in your thinking?
I don't restrict myself to thinking about sentience, sapience, or sociality. I think the sources of value in our world are multiple. And when it comes to people and many other animals, the sentience, sapience, sociality really fits and really speaks to why we have an intrinsic value ourselves. But it doesn't necessarily speak to why an ecosystem or a biome or a geosystem has intrinsic value. Mm-hmm. Now, this opens up a conversation that gets messy. Because of the multiple kinds of values, and because those values aren't necessarily exactly consonant with one another. But I have a broad sense of value. That's why I call myself a geocentrist, not a biocentrist or ecocentrist, certainly not an anthropocentrist, but a geocentrist, because I see people, animals, and nature all having intrinsic value, and they all have intrinsic value at different orders of magnitude, from the individual to the community to the system.
Mm-hmm. I wonder whether ethical arguments, even triangulated with science, can actually transform how human beings relate to animals.
That's a good question.
Ethical arguments have existed for decades, and the science of conservation biology has been around for at least 30 years. Do you sometimes think that a deeper change in perception may be more fundamental than ethics in science?
Tell me what you mean by a deeper change of perception.
Well, I'll go to Aldo Leopold, who, in the final chapter of his book, A Sand County Almanac, the chapter called Conservation Aesthetics, he says that the most important task is the development of the perceptive faculty, which he thought of as a matter of building receptivity into the human mind. Mm-hmm. So you can think of it, I guess, if you like, as an aesthetic perceptivity. That's why the chapter is called Conservation Aesthetics.
Ethics, yeah. Well, I think my answer to that is that it's a real good question. I don't know exactly, because you're absolutely right. You know, how we ought to live. Politics is ethics writ large. Those are framings from Socrates and Aristotle, respectively, that go back 2,500 years or more. And yet we're still in difficult straits today. So yes, perception seems to be, in that sense, it seems to be one of perhaps many other options that we need to exercise. So to structural change. We need to engage in structural change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I have some questions about that.
Okay, so we'll leave that. We'll leave that later on. The one thing I would say, though, is I'm a follower of Mary Midgley, and Mary Midgley believes in the integrated self, meaning that we can talk abstractly and usefully about reasons versus emotion, or perception versus evidence, or ethics versus science, but they're really interlaced together in very often complicated ways. This is especially true about reason and emotion, because they're very tightly laced together. And so I don't see the perception as being a non-ethics issue, as being something apart. I see it as intersecting, and as the sort of ethical and aesthetic is much more of a distinction than it is as a categorical difference. I'm not claiming you were saying it was a categorical difference, but I just think it's important to clarify that.
Right.
And yes, a good perception of seeing yourself as part of the natural world and seeing animals as fellow creatures, as kin, and I think is key. I do remember when I was sitting on Laveau Mountain and I was watching a dance. It didn't end up in death, but it could have been a death dance between a pack of wolves and a moose. This is in northern Minnesota, near the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And while I had been raised with animals and raised and taught to think about animals from an ethical perspective, I was still young and maturing as a young man. And seeing that ecology, what I've been taught about as an ecological relationship, and yet feeling the fear, the death, the value of their individual lives, the wolves trying to feed themselves and the moose defend themselves, really made me recognize how these questions are integrated and need to be thought of, to go back to your original, I think it was your first question, in an interdisciplinary manner that is open to their intersections.
Mm-hmm. You acknowledge a lot of this in your call for a broader cultural transformation beyond law and ethical philosophy in your writings. So let me just ask you directly, what is the role of art as well as stories and narratives in this process that you
I think
lay out?
They're absolutely transformative. Visualizing, narratizing, experiencing in those matters is another way of knowing. And it's a way of knowing that is more open to or opening of other individuals. I happen to be, an egghead who's, thought and written about this stuff from an analytic point of view, so to speak, really an interpretive point of view. But it's very much about words and concepts and interpretation and analysis and whatnot. Sometimes people are just moved, like I am, by sublime beauty. Mm-hmm. And when I see an amazing work of art, I'm drawn to nature photography, animal photography, more realistic depictions of animals in nature. I feel drawn into that. I feel connected to that. It reminds me that I'm a plain member of the land community, to put it in Leopold's terms, that I am a member of a larger community. And because of that, I have a responsibility. I have direct duties to others. Those narratives also are, so that's the art piece. The narratives are also really important because they create these imaginative spaces in which we can develop and interrogate and change our own worldview. I think about the role that Star Trek has had in our society. The very notion that we're talking about sentient animals and legislation across the world has been written to protect the sentient animals comes from Star Trek, from the 1960s, but then more specifically, the 1990s Star Trek Next Generation, discussions of sentient beings. Mm-hmm. And expanding people's understanding that we're not the only self-conscious creatures out there. That's just one, it may sound silly, illustration, but it's one really important illustration. Mm-hmm. We could also think of really negative illustrations. So I'll give you a concrete specific. Patagonia Films has an entry called Range Rider. Lovely film. If you haven't seen it, you should. They have interviews with the McIvers from Double M Ranch, who have been opponents of wolf recovery in Washington state. And they're very clear that they think those who care about wolves and those who care about animals are suffering under satanic influences. Mm-hmm. And the background to the worldview, if you read into it, is very, very biblical in terms of going out and subduing the earth. I may not agree with them at all, but they really think in their vision, based on this Christian narrative, that they're doing the right thing by subduing wildness and substituting it with domesticity. Here I am thinking about getting rid of wilderness, turning the range from grasslands and forests into the kind of range we need for cattle, and eliminating predators and other competitors to domesticated cattle.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a question about compassionate conservation. Following,
sure.
I know that it rejects the use of harmful practices in dealing with animals. It's highly attentive to that issue. Is this why some of the members of your organization, if I understand correctly, correct me if I'm wrong,
mm-hmm.
they favor predator recolonization instead of predator reintroduction? Can you elaborate on this?
Yes. So let me take you a step back. We've produced a number of compassionate conservation and practice articles that came out of the journal of Biological Conservation, and we've got a third one that's under review
mm-hmm.
right now. What we demonstrate there is compassionate conservation. It has a pluralistic framing, so that there's a range of perspectives. Some are absolutely opposed to any harmful or lethal management. Others accept harmful and lethal management in extreme cases. All of what unites them there is that you intervene in animals' lives only when necessary, and that's based on strong science and strong ethics, what we call strict scrutiny. Because of that, I'm guilty of this. Some of us have been inattentive to the harm done individual animals and their families during restoration projects through translocating individuals. So I really didn't think too much about grabbing wolves out of the wild and dropping them somewhere else as long as restoration occurred. That was, or wolf recovery occurred. I've thought about that a lot more recently and find it deeply problematic. Mm-hmm. Because you're not only ripping someone without any choice from their environs, which are both social and natural, you're dumping them in an area, especially if you do hard releases as opposed to soft releases, where they can sustain severe harm, including death. And the members of their social group left behind, and if we're talking about wolves, we're talking about a family, are deeply harmed by the loss of those individuals, especially if those individuals are alpha or beta individuals who have direct responsibility for thinking about the hunt, for thinking about raising kids, and the well-being of the pack as a whole. Mm-hmm. So yes, it makes sense under that context that we allow wolves to move and recover on their own instead of kidnapping them and dumping them down in an area. Right. Colorado is a good example of this. Colorado made this decision to grab a bunch of Oregon wolves and then BC wolves and dump them in a hard release, 2 hard releases in Colorado. I understand. I know Jeff Davis, who was the head of CPW at the time. I understand the legislative and legal needs to do what they needed to do. At the same time, I think it was, and I'm not being critical and saying anyone was acting unethically per se. What I'm saying is I disagreed with the ethics of grabbing these wolves out of the wild and dumping them in a hard release in Colorado. Better that we had worked on the politics at a national level to reopen the corridors of wolf recolonization through Montana, through Idaho, and through Wyoming.
Certainly something to think about. So we have now reached the point where we have to make a choice here. We've gone through 25 questions. I actually have 60 questions. So if you can, yeah, I don't know if you're able to continue, but if you can't,
sure, I'm able.
Okay, we can do the rest as what we do is we broadcast an hour-long radio show. It has to be 60 minutes, and then we continue as a YouTube. So what I need to do now is sign off pretty much with for the radio show. Then we'll call you back and go from there. Does that sound like a plan?
That sounds like a plan to me.
In closing, I want to say that I wholeheartedly agree with you that ethics is at least as important as science in securing the well-being of animals. Your idea of triangulating ethics and science with public policy is an interesting and insightful method and goal, in my opinion. Thank you, Bill, for doing this interview. It's been really good to hear your perspective.
And thank you, Glenn. It was my delight.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations with my guest, Bill Lynn, on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org. Please include a phone number.